entity, worked with a lawyer, and sought investment that was all lawyered, and in agreement with his employment contract. Then he left Amazon and he started working in commercial real estate development, which is his expertise. And he started working with developers to help them rezone land for data center use, because that is something that is really specialized. Not every piece of land can be used for a data center. You have to have water, power, fiber, all of these things. And then you have to work with the municipalities. So he started helping other real estate developers do that when he left Amazon. And then about 10 months after he had left, on April 2nd, 2020, the FBI knocked on our door in Seattle at around 6:45 a.m. And this is 2 weeks into the pandemic. So it was just a wild time for all of us. I answered the door. I had a baby on my hip. We had 4 little girls who were under 6 at the time. And, the FBI asked to speak to him. And they said, we're here to ask you questions about a real estate developer named Brian Watson. And, I'm a lawyer. And so I said to my husband, you can't talk to them without a lawyer, which nobody should ever talk to any law enforcement without a lawyer. But that kicked off this saga that still is going on today in some ways. I will say my husband was never ultimately charged with a crime, but Amazon alleged that he had, during and after his employment, somehow steered Amazon deals to real estate developers in exchange for kickbacks. And my husband did not do that. And he was never charged. And ultimately, many years of fighting later, a federal judge said that my husband's real estate development work was in compliance with his employment contract. There was no breach of contract, let alone a crime or any fraud or racketeering, which is also what Amazon claimed.
And I also read, so speaking of the FBI and showing up at your door, I was reading a few articles covering your story, and they talked a little bit about something called civil forfeiture. I was wondering if you might want to go into that, where they basically can seize your assets if you are, I guess, potentially involved in a crime. I'm wondering what evidence they had to do that, and what your experience with all of that was.
Yeah, thanks for asking, because I think if there's anything that I can take away from this experience, it's that we really need to abolish the practice of civil forfeiture in America. And I'll be honest and say I didn't even know it existed, which I think is a function of my privilege in America, because civil forfeiture impacts so many folks across the country. But in America, local, state, and federal government can seize your assets, your money, your home, car, on the suspicion that the asset is related to a crime. They don't have to charge you with a crime. They don't have to prove a crime. And you don't have a right to a timely hearing to try to prove your innocence. And the burden is on you to prove that your asset is innocent. The reason they can do all of this, it's really a legal fiction in America, but your bank account doesn't have due process like you do. And so they can just take your things. And I would also say that law enforcement is incentivized to take your things, because if they take your things and your money and you don't hire lawyers and fight to get it back, they get to keep it. And so if you think about how police forces, if you think about how the FBI, like the funding that they have, a lot of it comes from taking Americans' things. And for me, it's like, if you show me the incentive, I'll show you the result, right? Like, if you're going to have civil forfeiture, don't let the people who are taking the things keep it, because they'll just keep taking things. Now, just the wildest part of this, James, is that this civil forfeiture for us happened in May of 2020, and the government actually took all of our bank accounts. We had 4 little girls, and they took my money, because my husband sometimes wired me money. So they went into his bank account, and then they were like, where is his money going? We're taking all that too. They took money my husband had paid to lawyers from a law firm client trust account. They took my father's money, because my father, who was 2 weeks post kidney transplant, was very, very ill and almost died, and we helped him financially. And after they took it, I will tell you, the prosecutors said to my husband's lawyers, well, if he just pleads guilty to Amazon's allegations, we'll give some of it back so you can feed your kids. The
That sounds like
most impossible.
extortion almost a little bit.
Well, it is. And I think another thing I've learned through this process is that prosecutors are allowed to extort you. They're allowed to lie. They're allowed to do all sorts of things, which is just it's not justice, it's bullying. And I can't imagine how any prosecutor would feel good about doing that. But anyway, with civil forfeiture, they took everything. And they took it pursuant to warrants. They have to get a warrant to take your things, with a probable cause affidavit that they got from a judge. But we've never seen the warrant or the affidavit. This happened in 2020. We got our money back, 85% of it, so long as we promised not to sue the government in 2022. Um, but we've still never been able to see the allegations through which they took our money. Those documents were supposed to be unsealed on April 1st, 2024. But the government has now asked the court to seal them forever. So we can never see the allegations under which they took our money.
Yeah, I find that to be a little bit disturbing. But so in terms of just getting the overall story, I'm wondering in terms of the overall timeline, you mentioned that the FBI showed up at your doorstep after your husband had already left the job at Amazon. So I'm wondering why Amazon, or I don't know if you have any insight into this, I'm sure you do. Why did Amazon feel the need to go after your husband?
Yeah, I mean, this is something like we spent years untangling, and it was really hard to figure out. And frankly, the only reason we did figure all of it out is because Amazon sued my husband in civil court too, and that case went into discovery, which is the exchange of information. What we learned in civil discovery is that this related to a set of data centers we'll call the North Star data centers. Amazon was leasing these data centers from a joint venture between a real estate developer named Brian Watson, who had a company called North Star, and a capital partner, the money guys, named IPI. IPI is Iron Point Iconic. Iron Point is Robert Bass's fund, and Iconic is the family office of like Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, and others. So a lot of billionaires over there. IPI wanted to build its own data centers and not have a real estate development partner, and they wanted a relationship with Amazon. So they bought a real estate development company called Stack. And then they tried to get Brian Watson out of these deals with Amazon. They tried to buy him out. He didn't want to be bought out. But the contract between Brian Watson and IPI said that if Brian Watson was convicted of or pled guilty to a felony, he was out of the data centers. And what we know now is that IPI went to Amazon, said that Brian Watson was paying a kickback to this guy, Christian Kirshner, who then paid it to my husband. So my husband would steer Brian Watson deals. And then Amazon, without any investigation, and IPI together hired former federal prosecutors from the Eastern District of Virginia to lobby their former colleagues, still at the Eastern District of Virginia, for criminal charges. IPI broke the contract with Brian Watson in secret on February 19th, 2020. Their first meeting with the DOJ was on February 20th, 2020. Without getting a felony, IPI will probably owe Brian Watson hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, because these deals are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And Amazon got involved in helping IPI break the contract. Why? I have no idea. Frankly, I think they got hoodwinked by IPI. Like, I think I think they're just so big, and IPI came to them with these sensational allegations, and Amazon just said, okay, we're with you, and jumped.
And in some ways, or some would say that they didn't maybe expect the fight that went on afterwards, because I did understand that some of the names that you mentioned, some folks did plead guilty almost right away, which is, I think, maybe what they were hoping for. And also, I read recently, I think this was at the beginning of the year, the DOJ actually vacated the guilty pleas of, was it everybody that was involved in this case, or just some of the folks? But I understand that's kind of an anomaly that they would do something like
Yeah.
that.
There's one nuance I think is important that I think a lot of people don't understand when you're talking about guilty pleas and charges. Because my husband was pressured to plead guilty for years, and people were like, "Well, when was he charged before he was pressured to plead guilty?" And in America, like 92% or 98% of people who are accused of a federal crime plead guilty because taking it to trial costs millions of dollars. There's a trial penalty. Like the DOJ will actually try to put you in prison for longer if you don't plead and make them go to trial and prove the case. Um, and but the thing is that people plead guilty before they're charged. And so then it's all a negotiation of what you plead guilty to, et cetera. So my husband was never charged with a crime, and nobody was charged with a crime. But four men who didn't work at Amazon did plead guilty to Amazon's allegations. They all pled guilty to helping my husband criminally violate his employment terms. But if you remember, but all of the men, they'd never seen my husband's employment contract. They didn't know what Amazon's employment terms were. And so when we proved in the civil case that my husband had adhered to the terms of his contract, I know that the judge like reached out to the prosecutors and said, "What are you going to do about these guilty pleas? Because, the facts aren't right." Like this guy didn't violate his employment terms, so how could these people have criminally